going on? I'm Arch Manning, Viore athlete and college quarterback. Whether I'm running, training, traveling, or just unwinding at home, I love doing it in my core shorts from Viore. With a breathable boxer brief liner, they're quick to dry, super versatile, and stand up to even my most intense training sessions. Plus, they come in 3 inseams and a ton of colors. Ready to try a pair? Go to viore.com/arch and get 20% off at checkout. I think you're going to love them as much as I do. That's VUORI.com/ARCH and get 20% off your first order. Exclusions apply. Visit the website for full terms and conditions. Not only will you receive 20% off your first purchase, but enjoy free shipping on any U.S. orders over $75 and free returns. Have a great day.
World Cup fans have come from all over the world to see which country has the most athletic black people. Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, B-Side, the extended play to our Newsy Thursday show. I'm Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith, here to keep the B-side from ending up at the seaside.
Now, yesterday we looked into the forthcoming mayoral election in Manchester, the last gasps of the Starmer government, and the first squeals of Burnham's. Today we go to Scotland to bring you all the latest from Holyrood.
Our favourite Highlander, producer Kenny Campbell, met up with Stephen Boyd, who runs the progressive think tank IPPR Scotland. Let's have a listen.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome to B-Side, which today is all about what's happening in Scotland. Now, we're recording on a Monday, you're hearing it on Friday, and British politics is currently moving like a rocket on a shopping trolley. So let's caveat this by accepting that events may have developed a little bit by the time this lands. So this week, Andy Burnham set out what he wants to be the central idea of his presumed leadership, a major shift of power away from Whitehall, a number 10 north in Manchester, and what he calls good growth in every British postcode. That matters everywhere, of course, but it may matter especially in Scotland, because Scotland is already living inside a very concentrated version of the pressures now facing the whole UK. Low growth, strained public services, an ageing population, a fierce argument over tax, the politics of net zero, and deep, deep mistrust in institutions. Its politics? Well, they've been beset by the scunner factor. Effectively, lots of people are just very, very, very fed up with politics. The SNP, of course, remains the biggest party in Scotland after May's Holyrood elections, but it's short of majority. Its former chief exec, Peter Murrell, has been jailed for fiddling the party out of £400,000 in an episode that raised all sorts of questions about trust and internal party culture, and, of course, cost Nicola Sturgeon her job. And then finally, the 2 recent Scottish by-elections told very different stories. A Conservative gain in Aberdeen South, where energy politics loomed large, and an SNP hold in Arbroath and Broughty Ferry. So, today we're asking, what's actually happening in Scotland, and what might Andy Burnham's devolution agenda mean for the Union, for English regions, and for Scotland's own social democratic ambitions? My guest is Stephen Boyd, director of the progressive think tank IPPR Scotland. Stephen has spent more than 2 decades working in Scottish economic and social policy, including in the Scottish Government and previously at the Scottish Trades Unions Congress. So Stephen does actually know what he's talking about. Stephen Boyd, welcome to B-Side.
Hi, Kevin. Delighted to be here.
Stephen, the big question on everybody's lips today is, have you applied to be the next manager of the Whisper at the Scottish football team?
I have not. No, very interesting development over the weekend. I thought I might hang on, having just signed a long contract. But yeah, I think given the performances at World Cup, it was probably inevitable.
I know it's a decent fellow problem, isn't it? He comes away with his head held as high as he can, I dare say, getting us to 3 major championship finals, but then Scotland reverting to type. Would you take that job? Do you think that's a job that anybody in their right mind should take on?
I think it's still quite an attractive job. I mean, you have seen how the country comes behind the national team when they get to the World Cup. And there's been real excitement, real engagement over the last few months. I think we have better players than it was maybe reflected in our performances at the World Cup. I think there is an opportunity for a manager to get more out of the current set of players. Now, clearly we're a bit imbalanced. We've got an excellent midfield. We don't have that much up front. The defence is, is kind of journeyman.
Yeah, and everybody's getting a bit long in the tooth as well, aren't they?
But I think we could have done better. I think that, but there's a yearning for a more positive style of player out there, isn't there? So I think there's certainly possibilities that new manager could come in and get more out of it.
I did wonder if Scotland had actually qualified for the knockout phase, whether or not what we'd have seen would be a huge bump in support for independence, because the sort of the pride that was associated with the Scottish fans out in Boston in particular was huge. I had one eye on that. I was waiting for some opinion polls to come out showing whether or not the Scottish football team and the fans out there had actually done more to further the cause of independence than any political movement in the last 20 years. Controversial, but you never know.
I think there's probably something in that, but I think what you find is when the opinion polls go up and down, as soon as an actual referendum campaign proper starts and the harder questions start to get interrogated, then you find some of this is a wee bit softer than might appear at other times.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, Stephen, for listeners who don't live inside Scottish politics, how would you sum up Scotland politically and what's happening in Scotland right now?
Well, it's been a strange old time since the election back in May. I mean, as you've already mentioned, the SNP were returned as the largest party by some distance, but the composition of the parliament changed significantly. Now, you can argue in terms of kind of left-right blocks. There wasn't that much change, but we've now seen Reform move from 1 MSP to 17. I'm now the joint second largest party in the parliament. They have, every second week they lead the questioning of FM at First Minister's questions. We've now got a much bigger Green group. So it's interesting times. I mean, clearly the period since the election has been dominated by the Murrell scandal, so it's been difficult to take the real temperature, I think, of the new parliament.
Yes.
I think what is crystal clear from our perspective as a think tank, it's still very unclear how this new parliament will start to address very obvious challenges that Scotland faces, in which you've already listed. There's no real sense that, particularly in terms of the looming fiscal gap, so we know there's going to be a £5 billion gap is forecast to emerge between spending and revenues by 2029-30. This will have to be dealt with over this parliament. Quite how that will happen isn't clear yet. So, the coming years are going to be very interesting. I think it's fair to say that this parliament will be the most difficult session since devolution in 1999.
Right, okay. And do you get a sense that the atmosphere has changed in any way politically, particularly with the rise of reform? Do things feel different when you're talking to people who engage with politics, or indeed when you're talking to people who are not engaged with politics?
I think things have changed over the last couple of years. We've seen, for instance, immigration rising in saline, so it never really hit over 10% in Scotland over the last few years. It's now quite often cited as one of the top 3 or 4 issues that people think about. And clearly that's related to the rise of reform in some ways. I mean, it's been interesting watching the first few sessions of First Minister's questions in this new parliamentary session. In some ways it's different. So Reform are talking about issues that hitherto hadn't been talked about that much in the Scottish Parliament. But in terms of the kind of standard knockabout between MSPs and the First Minister, it's kind of more of the same. And again, I'm kind of hoping that this Parliament will see an increase in seriousness, if you want to put it like that, in terms of addressing these key challenges that Scotland faces. And I'm sad to say that over the first few weeks of this Parliament, there's been little sign of that. So I think it's still early days. It's difficult to say to what real extent things have changed and how this Parliament will be different to those that came before. But certainly in some ways you can see some changes, but in terms of the bigger picture, it looks like more of the same.
Well, something I suppose that could change the tone, the flavour of what goes on at Holyrood is very much to do with what's happening this week at Number 10. Now, it's kind of tricky for us because we're recording this just as Andy Burnham finishes giving his speech on devolution. But essentially, Burnham, as we expected, has put devolution very much at the centre of his pitch, including the idea of shifting power and attention, it should be said, away from Whitehall and towards what we call the nations and the regions. How do you think that might land for Scotland? Is this a serious rebalancing of the UK that we might see, or is it likely to create new tensions for the existing devolution settlement, I suppose?
Yep. So it could do both. I think to be fair to Burnham, he seems genuinely committed to a devolutionist agenda. So I think if nothing else, we can expect this UK, or assuming Burnham becomes Prime Minister, we can assume his government to work more constructively with the Scottish government, as has been the case under some of his predecessors. So it would just be nice, I think, both governments working in harmony to try to get the best out of current devolved powers in terms of those big challenges Scotland's facing. So that would be an improvement. I think in terms of potential additional powers, this current Scottish government haven't been very clear on what in particular they'd be looking for. They're kind of always looking for more powers, but they haven't been very specific.
Right.
We would argue there's some things round about, the fiscal framework could be revisited. So I think certainly some flexibility for Scotland around about borrowing powers would be interesting. I think there's been some noises over the weekend about devolving Job Centre Plus and various employability mechanisms. I think that would be useful for Scotland, but certainly that would, we're at the very start of that debate. But if nothing else, we hope that will be conducted in constructive terms. But I think there's also a kind of broader challenge in the Scottish Government. It was interesting when I started this job 2 years ago, and I spent the first couple of months speaking to people across all manner of stakeholders in Scotland about what they regarded as the challenges and opportunities facing Scotland. And one key theme in which there was almost complete consensus was the state of local democracy in Scotland isn't very good. So, we've seen devolution happen in 1999, but since then we've seen a centralisation of powers within Scotland. So,
right.
I wonder if the Burnham premiership might provoke the Scottish Government into being a bit more creative about devolution within Scotland. So, it would be interesting to see if that emerges.
That's a very interesting point, because Britain, and it's something that has been highlighted by Burnham and those around Burnham as well, Britain, in terms of the developed world, is one of the most centralised political operations around. It seems to be very much our natural default position in Britain to centralise as much as we can. And even then, as you've said, when we devolve powers to the home nations, that we still have this centralisation happening on a smaller scale as well. It's almost like it's in our DNA. What underpins an awful lot of what Holyrood can do, of course, is the amount of money it's got to spend. And that, of course, brings us on to the likes of the Barnett formula. Burnham has previously called for an English version of the Barnett formula to help the English regions. What do you think that would mean for Scotland? In other words, does English devolution strengthen the union by making the UK less London-centric, or does it weaken Scotland's very distinctive character inside it?
It's a good question. I think it's very much contingent on what Burnham actually has planned, and it's not really clear to me what it does have planned. I think you can envisage models of regional financing in the UK that really don't impinge on Scotland's experience of the Barnett formula, and then you can envisage others. Essentially, if it's going to mean a more equitable distribution of finance across England, does that potentially threaten Scotland's relatively generous settlement through the Barnett formula? It could. I would be very surprised if politically that's somewhere that Burnham wants to go.
Yeah.
And I think the Barnett formula has, if nothing else, people can always throw legitimate criticisms after it, but it has provided for some stability. It's been a stable solution, which has got a broad range of political buy-in. So I would be very surprised if that's something that he went after. But again, there are ways in which Scotland's fiscal settlement at the moment could be strengthened. And again, I point to, flexibility around the borrowing powers. It would help Scotland navigate economic downturns a wee bit more creatively than we're able to do at the moment. It's the kind of thing that I think that both Burnham and the Scottish Government should be looking at.
Quiet, Riot.
Starting or growing your own business can be intimidating and lonely at times. Your to-do list may feel endless with new tasks, and lists can easily begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything as a built-in business partner can be a game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Gymshark, Rare Beauty, and Heinz, to brands just getting started. Shopify has hundreds of ready-to-use templates that can help you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand's style. And you can tackle all the important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. And if people haven't heard about your brand, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you, with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns to reach customers wherever they're scrolling or strolling. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. That's shopify.com/realm.
Quiet, Riot.
Are there any lessons from Holyrood that Burnham could take on board, do you think? The answer may well be no, But of course, if he's wrestling with the idea of the challenges of democratising politics, particularly throughout England, you kind of think there must be something that you could take from Holyrood and indeed from the Senate as well. Very different sets of experiences. There's a lot of learning in both these seats of power, isn't there? Is there anything at all you think that you should take away as a wise lesson?
Well, that's a very good and challenging question, and I'm struggling to provide a positive answer, to be
Good
honest.
man, I'm here to make life difficult for you, Stephen.
I think it's certainly possible to look at things, learning things the Scottish Government has done through the devolved period that Burnham should not learn from. So I think the kind of multiple attempts to reform local taxation have came to nothing, really, is certainly a learning. And I think the fact that nobody has been satisfied with the council tax, and essentially we remain stuck with the model with some very minor changes kind of 27 years into devolution is, a very compelling criticism of the way the Scottish Parliament has addressed, difficult and important issues. And I think the inability to kind of reform, so we're stuck with a system of local governments that was implemented by the Tories in the 1990s. There was a large degree of gerrymandering in that, just trying to ensure that they had the opportunity to win local authorities in Scotland that hitherto they never really had a chance. It's not a settlement anybody's particularly happy with. It's not one that works socially or economically, I would argue. I don't think this is an area in which the Scottish Parliament has covered itself in glory since 1999.
There's also the heavy hints that government is going to be much more involved in running things like the water companies, the transport networks, big infrastructure, that Burnham does want to bring more of that stuff back under public control. And of course, Scotland's had one or two difficult experiences with that. I mean, the ferries fiasco sort of springs to mind, that governments can pile in with the best of intentions and then they collide with the real world and things seem to go wrong very, very quickly indeed. Is that something that should be a little red flag, I suppose, for Burnham in terms of his enthusiasm for wanting to bring more of what henceforth has been a very failed part of the private sector back into public control?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an area in which government should always tread cautiously. I mean, there's certainly some kind of lazy thinking on the left. There's just an assumption that public ownership necessarily means an improvement in outcomes, and certainly ferries would be a very sober lesson, and that's not necessarily the case. I think, all these sectors are a wee bit different in how government should think about them. So clearly water privatisation, I would argue, has been somewhat disastrous in England. I think the experience of Scottish water has generally, well, certainly relative to England, I would say has been very positive.
Yeah, so water is not privatised in Scotland, is it?
Yeah. So I think the experience of Scottish water is absolutely something that the UK government could learn from. It was established quite deliberately as a public corporation. I think there are upsides and downsides to that, but it has been a stable model, which again, it's not beyond criticism, but relative to the privatised English companies, I think it's performed very well. Ferries is an interesting example. I mean, to what extent are the problems down to how the public sector has chosen to run those services, or is it down to the lack of investment in new ferry infrastructure? I would argue it's very much down to the latter. But that does show you that once services are nationalised and the finances are then recorded on the public finances, it can be difficult sometimes to invest at the levels that are required, and you've seen the consequences of that in the ferry services. So I think Burnham should be looking at these things. I mean, I think privatisation has just not worked particularly well. It's not something I've looked at particularly closely, but it looks as if the experience of the bus network in Manchester could be a positive lesson to draw from. Certainly, I live in Glasgow, and you're still largely a privatised service. It's not great, and it's very expensive. If you compare it to the publicly owned service in Edinburgh, it's night and day. So I think
I've not been in Edinburgh for.
Absolutely, as Edinburgh buses are, very well known for reliability, cleanliness, etc.
Please, what's the difference? Why is Edinburgh so much better than Glasgow, do you think?
It seems to be the public service ethos, some of the buses are there to serve the communities, and you look at the kind of timetables and the regularity of services to kind of outline areas are way better and cheaper in Edinburgh than they are in Glasgow, certainly. So again, I'm sure the Edinburgh services could be improved, but kind of relative to where we're still relying on the services deregulated back in the 1980s, it seems to be a much higher quality.
Talking about things like bus services and train services, talking about things like water and housing, actual, the nuts and bolts of day-to-day life, which is something that Burnham is very much focusing on right now. It's plugging into a renaissance on the high streets. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know how many times I've heard politicians promise a renaissance on the high streets, only for another wave of changes to come along and the high streets remain just as bad as they were this time last year. It is at least an acknowledgement that whatever highfalutin arguments and rows we all like to have when we're discussing politics, actually the things that matter to people are the day-to-day challenges of living a very ordinary life, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I think the priorities that he seems to have sketched out today are ones I think that will resonate with people. I mean, these are parts of people's lives that are just not functioning very well at this moment in time. And I think crucially, if we can get transport infrastructure, if we can get housing right, if we can get the state of our high streets improved, these are things that have a social and economic payback, and I think that's very important to emphasise. Yeah. Interestingly, my daughter's just got a job up in Inverness. She's delighted with the job, real, an area she wanted to work in, real opportunities for progression. Finding housing up there was incredibly difficult. She's now got a room in a house she's paying over £600 a month for, and she thought about living in some of the outlying areas where we have been on holiday in the recent past. The public transport from those areas just wouldn't have allowed her to work in Inverness. So the point, I don't want to pick in Inverness, but the point I'm making is if we invest in these areas, people get housing, which is great, hopefully lower costs for people, but it also allows our economy to function much more efficiently if people can move to the jobs that suit them and the employer best. So if we can get this stuff right, it's great for people, lower their costs, but it will help improve economic efficiency in the longer term as well.
Let's look at trust then, because politics and trust in Scotland have taken a real kicking in recent months because of the Peter Murrell scandal. Now, the SNP, as we've said, is still the biggest party in Scotland, but Murrell's jailing has put trust and culture and party control very much back under the spotlight. Do you think it's changed anything fundamentally, or are voters really pricing the damage in already?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the polling, then something absolutely fundamental has changed since, if you look at the last Scottish election in 2021, at that point, trust in the Scottish government was certainly, again, relative to the UK government, was through the roof. It was much more trusted as an institution. Since then, it's declined precipitously. Now, it seems to be that Operation Branch Forms, or the arresting of Murrell and Nicola Sturgeon, etc., then through a focus on other things that people weren't particularly happy about. So it encouraged people to look at the ferries scandal in a different way. It encouraged them to look at public services much more critically. And the kind of conflation of all these things, as we've seen that real drop in trust, which is a worry, because when that's related, we've spoken about the fiscal gap, our ability to tax the level of taxation that you're able to level on the public is highly related to the trust they have in government. They want to have trust that that money that they're giving to government will be used wisely. You've clearly seen a big difference, although the SNP are still the largest party by a distance in the Scottish Parliament. Their vote fell very significantly between 21 and 26. The drop in turnout was almost wholly attributable to the SNP losing voters. So something has changed there.
Quiet, Riot. This is going to be an extremely busy month. I have to watch 104 soccer games, follow the pregame, the postgame, yell useless opinions at the TV. It's a lot. So I knew that when it comes to screening for colon cancer, the choice was clear. The Cologuard Plus test. It can be used at home and can only take 15 minutes, so I can do it during halftime and not miss any action. If you are 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about screening for colon cancer with the Cologuard test. You can also request a prescription at Cologuard.com.
Quiet, Riot.
That kind of brings us on quite naturally, just to sort of recap the recent Scottish by-elections, which we covered on the show as they were happening. Actually, I was in a lay-by behind a petrol station in the north of Glasgow as the results were coming through. A night never to be forgotten, it must be said. The Scottish by-elections were somewhat overshadowed by what was happening in Makerfield with Burnham and his speech that night. But were they actually more revealing about Scotland than perhaps we've given them credit for?
I think they were interesting, and I think they probably confirmed some things that we already knew. So we knew that the SNP were increasingly under challenge in the North East due to their position in oil and gas, widely regarded as not being particularly credible. given those circumstances and the Tories throwing the kitchen sink at the Aberdeen South by-election, it was no great surprise that they won that.
Yep.
I think there's potentially some interesting things there around about the reform votes, that they really didn't make the inroads that they might have hoped in these elections. I mean, does that suggest that, there is a lower ceiling on the reform vote than there seems to be across the rest of the UK? I think that's probably the case. Does it suggest that reform's early days in the Scottish Parliament haven't played particularly well with voters? We've seen the trouble in Glasgow and Edinburgh, kind of post-incident in Belfast a few weeks ago. I think reform's apparent inability to, come out and strongly condemn the violence that we've seen on the streets, I don't think played particularly. We don't have good polling in this yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if that played quite badly with voters. And I think it also shows us that Labour, certainly under a UK Starmer government, are in a bit of a bind in Scotland and find it very difficult to get any traction in these by-elections. But so, they were very interesting outcomes, but I think probably confirmed what we already knew rather than there's anything particularly new and interesting.
One of the sort of big takeaways for me from the by-election results was the fact that net zero has become very much a very difficult issue in the northeast of Scotland. The glory days of Aberdeen as the oil capital of Europe are well behind it. And the idea that Aberdeen might be happy to take one for the sake of the economy, of the environment, I should say, has been fairly roundly rejected. But we've also seen net zero be problematic for Ed Miliband, and his ambitions to be Chancellor are labouring under the fact that there is a fear, I use that word advisedly, about his commitment to net zero. Do you get the impression that the politics of net zero are becoming generally more difficult simply because the cost of living is ever larger in people's minds, and that phase where we were giving a damn about the planet has kind of passed, ironically enough, given the weather we're seeing in this country this week?
I think there's a lot in that, but I think, it also reflects the success of some on the political right at connecting problems with living standards to net zero in a way that I don't think really bears much scrutiny. The fact that prices have risen for ordinary people is very tangentially related to net zero, I would argue. It's interesting, we did some analysis post the Scottish election looking at the salience of net zero in the party manifestos, and it dropped massively since 2021. So the SNP, Labour, and even the Greens to an extent were talking less about net zero and climate change than they were in 2021. Other polling that us and others have done recently shows that the public, particularly progressive voters, so SNP, Labour, Green and Lib Dem voters, are still pretty strongly behind the net zero agendas. Over 60% still strongly support or tend to support action to address climate change. Even for all voters, there still is a majority supporting action to address climate change. So I think there's a lot of different things going on. I think there's absolutely clearly issues in the northeast, and you can understand why people in Aberdeen are worried about this agenda. I think not so much just about what's happening in oil and gas, but the inability to establish a steady stream of jobs and renewables through which people can pass from one industry into the other. And I think also, the very ambitious rhetoric we've heard from a lot of politicians from frankly, the last 20 years about Scotland being a Saudi Arabia of renewables, about just transition, and this heavy implication that people would be able to move seamlessly between oil and gas and into renewables, which I think was probably never the case.
Something that has fascinated me about the output from your organisation is sort of some of the stuff that you've produced on growth. And growth has been a hot topic forever, really, but in the Starmer government, it's been a particularly hot topic. You've written that growth is good for progress, but not growth for growth's sake. What's that mean in plain English? What is good for progress but not growth for growth's sake all about?
So I think growth matters because it becomes easier to do good things when the economy is growing. We can spend more in health, education, care, etc. than we can otherwise do. And I think when spending on public services and redistribution more generally becomes a zero-sum game, the politics are next to impossible. So growth kind of matters in that regard. But I think for broader social progress, and this is something that's often lost from the debate, I think that growth really matters as well. There's been loads of good work done across all countries in time about this. And when the economy's grown, you tend to see more measures to help, improve gender and racial equality, to improve environmental protection, these kind of things.
Right.
We've seen 20 years of relative stagnation in the UK. We've seen, Farage and Brexit. We've seen rising nativism. We've seen, now really kind of avert pushbacks about gender and racial equality of the kind that I think they'd struggled to envisage only a few years ago. Now, is that all down to a stagnant economy? Of course it isn't, but I think the stagnant economy certainly creates the conditions in which these views get more traction than they otherwise would.
It's hard to argue with that, isn't it? The idea that low growth is, if not the only reason, then certainly a core reason why politics has become so angry and, as you said, zero sum. And in Scotland, the scunner factor, this idea that people are just fed up to the back teeth of politics, is presumably tied very much to the idea that the pound in the pocket doesn't buy them anything like as much as it did even a couple of years ago. And politicians themselves are hamstrung, aren't they? If the growth isn't there to start with, there is a very limited amount that you can do to improve things for voters without making things worse for other constituencies, if that makes sense.
And it's just very hard to improve, to increase economic growth at this moment in time. And it's particularly hard in Scotland with the powers of the Scottish Parliament holds. I mean, you look back at the election campaign through April, May, all parties were saying that they would, well, maybe with the exception of the Greens, but all parties were saying that they would improve economic growth in Scotland, and talking about mechanisms which, frankly, would probably have made next to no difference over the course of the next parliamentary term. Now, you can argue about the merits of doing these things. Clearly, Tories in Reform talking a lot about tax cuts, Labour and SNP talking more about kind of industrial policy approaches. There are pluses and minuses to all of this, but the idea that any of this would tangibly have affected the rate of economic growth over the next 4 or 5 years, I think is kind of ludicrous. And again, politicians are not helping the seriousness of policy debate in Scotland by promising things which ultimately they just can't deliver.
I mean, let's dive into that a tiny bit more deeply, because obviously the Scottish Parliament has different tax-raising powers to Westminster, and income tax rates are different and higher in Scotland, across the whole. Not surprisingly, in Scotland, people want a strong welfare state. I think you'd say that about large parts of England as well. They want lower poverty, likewise, and better public services. But can we actually afford the social democratic model that so many people want without stronger growth? And has the tax debate reached the end of the easy road, if indeed the tax debate was ever an easy road up here?
Yeah, so I think maintaining what we have in terms of social protection in Scotland will be very difficult unless we find more growth in the economy, let alone trying to improve and extend social protection that's available to people in Scotland. I think there's a really rich debate about the nature and shape of the welfare state in Scotland moving forward. They recently published a paper that they called More Than a Safety Net, which was looking at a range of other countries across Europe who all have stronger social protection currently available in Scotland, but crucially, they've all got economies on, looking at any measure, are much more productive, innovative and dynamic than our economy. So they managed to do it. I think Scotland can too, although it is a very long-term, very difficult project. And again, anybody who pretends that this stuff can be done easily has not been particularly serious. I think the debate about taxation in Scotland has to improve, and I think this has to stem up by all parties on the progressive side acknowledging that if we want a stronger welfare state in Scotland, then we all have to pay for it. Now, if you look at what taxpayers in Scotland pay as a proportion of their income, at the kind of bottom decile, it's roughly the same as the rest of the UK and roughly the same as a basket of Northern and Western European countries. If you look at the top, it's roughly the same. They pay a wee bit more in Scotland than they do in the rest of the UK, a wee bit less than they do in the Nordic and Benelux countries. But if you look at the median voter in Scotland, they pay way less, right? So the idea that we can establish a sustainable tax regime which funds the kind of welfare state that the SNP, Labour, Greens, Lib Dems tell us they would like to have in Scotland, only by taxing the wealthier more, I don't think is remotely serious.
So it's not actually as progressive a tax system as you might think at first glance?
I would argue we worry far too much about the progressivity of the tax system. We should be thinking about the progressivity of tax and spending as a whole.
Right.
So if you look, the Nordics are the best example. We'll talk about the Nordics in Scotland. They're a great example. They're very, very successful countries. And you look at their tax regimes, they achieve higher tax revenues than Scotland does on an annual basis. But, everybody pays for them. So Denmark's a really good case in point. The top rate is income tax in Denmark. They don't have national insurance, so it's just income tax. It's 55%. But that kicked in at a threshold of 1.3 times average earnings. So if you think what that would mean in Scotland, it basically mean half of all workers paying 55% essentially, in income tax. But this allows Denmark to spend money in hugely progressive ways. I mean, childcare would be a really good example again, which allows their economy and labour market to function more efficiently than ours does. So nobody's arguing that you can move from Scotland to Denmark tomorrow, but I think we have to be honest and understand that no country has ever established the kind of welfare state that the current Scottish Government tells us that it wants to have on the basis of just taxing higher earners more. Everybody has to pay. The Scottish income tax schedule, we've got pretty significant devolved tax powers in Scotland. The income tax schedule has basically been designed to justify a debating point that half of all taxpayers pay less than they do in England. So those in the bottom half of the income distribution pay marginally less, and it's like £30 or less than UK taxpayers. But those in the upper half pay significantly more, and depending on how much you earn, very significantly more. Now, that's justifiable to an extent. There are these taxpayers benefit from services free at the point of provision, not free, as the SNP sometimes like to say, but they benefit from things they don't receive in the rest of the UK. But looking at the longer term, it's not a structure that's going to underpin the kind of welfare state they tell us they want to establish in Scotland.
Is it a hot issue with any voters, the fact that some of them are paying higher taxes than they would if they moved to Carlisle, for example?
It is now. It doesn't seem to have been a major issue. Polling questions around about tax are very sensitive, as to how the question is actually asked. So people tend to be comfortable with government taxing more, but only if someone else is paying, basically. So I don't think we have great information on that. I mean, interestingly, since the income tax regimes diverged between Scotland and the rest of the UK, we have seen immigration from the rest of the UK increase into Scotland. And again, some of the the business lobby, some of the political right in Scotland like to pretend that people only make these locational decisions on the basis of tax, but of course they don't. You're working in London, you're having to pay half your income in rent. If you move even to Edinburgh, which is an expensive city to live in, you can
not cheap, Edinburgh, no.
Yeah, but you can be saving a lot of money. You can be, achieving a higher quality of life. If you've got kids about to go through university, you're not paying tuition fees. So, all I'm trying to say is, things are not perfect in Scotland. Certainly not regarding the tax schedule. But, people make locational decisions on a range of factors, not just tax. And at the moment, Scotland seems to be chugging along reasonably well.
And it's not the case that lots of people who are stony broke south of the border have said, well, if I move to Ayrshire, I'll not be stony broke anymore because the Scottish tax regime is a wee bit kinder to people who've not got any money in the bank. We haven't been flooded with folk going, aha, I can save a few quid in my tax by moving to Scotland.
Yeah. I mean, of course, people these are really difficult decisions for people, and to listen to the political debate, you think that as soon as the tax rate changes, there's a flood of people moving from location X to location Y. Yeah. So it's very sticky, people have got family responsibilities, etc. And actually the rate of kind of, movement across the UK labour market is much lower than it is, for instance, across American states, where you quite often have quite large cities sitting close by each other. People only move to, between Scotland and England, or from England to Scotland. They've got a pretty strong incentive to do so. And I don't think tax is really providing that level of incentive.
Quiet, Riot.
Welcome to a new era of baseball's great spectacle, the T-Mobile Home Run Derby, live on Netflix. The biggest sluggers in baseball put their talents to the test on All-Star Weekend. Raw power meets star power. Big swagger meets bigger slams. And you don't swing to make contact. You swing to make history. Watch the T-Mobile Home Run Derby live on Netflix, Monday, July 13th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
Quiet, Riot.
We should probably look at demographics in a tiny wee bit more detail as well, because demographics are something that it's a global challenge, it's a Western challenge, it's a British challenge, but you've identified demographics as being one of Scotland's biggest structural challenges as well. Do you think that Scotland needs immigration more than the UK political debate is willing to admit?
I think it probably does. I mean, I think it's very important to say that immigration isn't a panacea for our demographic challenges, but it can help, and it can certainly help labour supply issues around the edges. You've seen over the last few years the number of Scottish sectors struggling to find, with Brexit, with COVID, etc. They've been struggling to find the workers they need. Immigration can help with that, certainly. I think in Scotland we've had traditionally, up until very recently, we've had a very different kind of debate about immigration, and I think there has been something of a consensus amongst the main parties. Reform accepted, that immigration was necessary into Scotland. There has been some discussion about Scotland potentially, achieving devolved powers in that regard. But I think there's, a widespread recognition that our challenge is a bit different from the rest of the UK, and immigration can play a positive role in helping to address that. Clearly, with reform now active and vocal in Parliament, that debate has changed somewhat in nature. I think there's clearly been issues about recent waves of immigration, how that's been handled in some cities, and reform able to kind of play on that, to kind of change the nature of the debate in Scotland. So I think it's certainly become more challenging, but I think we still cling on to a degree of consensus in Scotland that I think just isn't reflected in the rest of the UK.
And then finally, Stephen, is Scotland really a test case for whether social democracy can survive low growth and ageing voters, can survive climate backlash and collapsing trust? Or should listeners outside Scotland not care about Scotland any more than they care about the rest of the country?
Yeah, so I think Scotland as a test case probably not the best one. I think there's other countries do this better. So we've already spoken about the Nordics, and I think social democracy is just, the history of social democracy in these countries is just so different to Scotland. They've had a real theory of the welfare state in these countries, a real sense of the economic development and full employment is absolutely central to the model, and, they've thought about the social side and the economic side in absolute harmony in a way that we haven't done. So I think whether or not the welfare state can survive the kind of, the demographic, environmental, technological transitions that all advanced nations are currently going through, I would look to these other countries for the ultimate answer there. But nevertheless, I think other countries should, Scotland's a really interesting case in many regards, as part of the UK and having significant devolved powers. I think our ability to navigate this in a way that's different from the rest of the UK can tell people really interesting and important things. But, if we're going to make progress in those areas, then it requires the Scottish Government and Parliament, I think, acting in ways that, are different from it's been the case in the last few years.
And given how much time you've spent operating in these environments, are you yourself more pessimistic or optimistic about the future for Scotland, and indeed the future for the rest of the country, than you were, say, 10 years ago?
That's a good question. I wasn't 10 years ago, just immediately post-Brexit, I wasn't feeling
I think you're not the only one there. Don't worry about that, Stephen.
So, honestly, I felt, through most of the election campaign in April and May, I felt quite pessimistic. I thought the level and nature of the debate was nothing like what we should be having in Scotland, given the scale of the challenges we face. The period since, a lot of the conversations I've been having with people and politicians recently elected to Parliament, it's made me a bit more optimistic. I do think there are real opportunities in Scotland, on the economic and social side, to be doing new and different things that can help, put our country in a much better place to address these challenges, but also show the rest of the UK potentially a way forward as well. So I try to cling on to my positivity through all these challenges, Kenny. It can be difficult at times.
Well, listeners, if you want to find out more about what Stephen and his organisation does, actually, I'm going to ask Stephen to do his own wee advert almost as a call to action. Stephen, tell us just a tiny wee bit more about the IPPR and where people can find out a bit more about what you do.
Yeah, so all our outputs are on our website, so just Google IPPR Scotland and it should come up the top of your feeds. We've published recently reports, I've already mentioned one, more than a safety net, so this is looking at what has to happen if we want to build out a stronger social democracy in Scotland. What do we have to do on the social side, what do we have to do on the economy side? Now, it's very much the start of that debate, we're not claiming to have all the answers, but we think that's probably a key debate facing the country moving forward. We also recently published a report called More for Less, question mark. That was looking at public sector reform, and people listening in Scotland will be aware that the election campaign was really dominated by grand claims about what could be achieved through public sector reform and the huge amount of money that could be saved if we just, for instance, consolidate or abolish a few quangos. We are very challenging of that agenda. We think there are certainly, public services can be improved and should be improved, but we think the potential for saving a lot of money over the course of this Parliament and doing so is pretty limited. We're really keen to engage with people, so if anybody are interested in what we're doing, please get in touch. All our contact details are on the website, and love taking time in this conversation.
Smashing. Stephen, it's been a genuine pleasure talking with you today, and not just because of your accent, and not just because we've got a shared misery after the World Cup. And hopefully you'll join us again at some point in the future as well.
I would love to. Have really enjoyed it. Thanks, Kenny.
Quiet, Riot.
Naomi, that was really interesting in that when we hear from you during the Wales special, we see kind of a perfect microcosm of national politics. Whenever we hear from Scotland, we see often a sort of inversion, or it's a very, very different environment.
It is.
So, how much of a problem for Labour would it be losing its Scottish voter base?
Every time that Labour has formed a UK government, since the party became a major force in British politics in the early 20th century, it has done so by winning a very substantial chunk of constituencies in Scotland.
Yeah.
Right up to and including 2024, when they won the highest share of the vote in Scotland. And the first time they'd been topping the polls there for well over a decade. It got 37 out of the 57 seats. And if you remember, back in 2019, they nearly got wiped out, right? They lost all of their Scottish gains from 2017 and were left with just one seat. That was dear old Ian Murray, hanging on as the only Labour MP in Edinburgh South.
Being told that Scotland's politics is a lot more progressive, so the Corbyn should have been more attractive up there.
But I think that is actually something of a myth. I think the political culture of Scotland is broadly similar. It's not that different to the political culture of England.
But it's the constitutional question that changes.
Exactly.
It.
But the pattern holds. Like 97, Labour won 56 out of 72 Scottish seats. Even in 1945, Labour gained 17 seats to hold 37 out of 74 in Scotland.
Yeah.
So there really is very little route to victory for a Labour Party getting the keys to number 10 without performing extremely well in Scotland. And it's something I get very exercised about, and listeners will probably be familiar with that. The obsession within the Parliamentary Labour Party and pundits in and around Labour about the red wall voter and making sure that voter is happy and catered for is so often diametrically opposed to what the Labour voters of Scotland, Wales and urban voters in England, who would be predisposed to Labour, want. And it's electoral suicide. History's proven it. And I don't think anything, even Andy Burnham, can buck that trend. I don't think you can surrender Scotland to the red wall and hope to hold on to the keys to number 10, even if that number 10 is based in Manchester.
Yeah. I mean, this is not to disagree with you, because I think you're right, for many, many reasons. I think any party of government should aspire to be a national party, actually, and should aspire to be at least present and pretty strong in all three constituent nations. Northern Ireland is a separate case, but even there are reflections of the system here. So this isn't to disagree with your basic point, but it's also true to say that Labour used to win strong Scottish seats all the time for quite a long period, and that didn't automatically translate into them getting into government. And of the last 4 elections that they have won, only in one of them would the Scottish seats have made a critical difference. What I mean is, for Blair's first and second time and the 2024, Labour would have had a majority even without a single Scottish seat.
If I had one criticism of Burnham's speech on Monday, it was that Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales felt like an afterthought in the speech. Yeah. And then I thought, well, let me give him the benefit of the doubt. It was mostly a speech about devolution, and those nations are already devolved. So maybe he was coming at it from the perspective of who would I be to tell them how to govern themselves? They are already, pretty independent in terms of devolved powers, and I shouldn't, impose that top down. But then he had something in his speech where he referenced Bangor.
Yeah.
And there are 2 Bangors. There's Bangor Northern Ireland and Bangor Wales, and he meant Bangor Wales. And it just smacked of a speechwriter who wasn't really looking at the lens, at it through the lens of the whole of the UK. So, look, he's never going to be perfect.
Progress.
Absolutely
because
progress.
His acceptance speech in Manchester was all about...
Of course.
the north.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
It really didn't reach out to any other area or region.
No, and I would like to, put to you the question of Scottish independence and whether Burnham might be more willing to offer a referendum. Do you think that no, he needs to just reinvigorate Scottish Labour and lean into the Scottishness and the Welshness of Labour rather than having them as branches of an English Labour Party, as we've discussed before?
I think the latter should definitely happen. If he is serious about devolution, letting go centrally of power, then that applies to the party too, doesn't it? Yeah. It doesn't just apply to government. Local people know how to manage their affairs on the whole a lot better. And I would argue that is even more the case with electoral politics, that it would free Scottish Labour to say, you are now a separate entity. We are sister parties like, the Greens of England and Wales and Scottish Greens, but we are not necessarily attached to the
legally bound
policy-wise. So I think that would be, I don't want to say smart because I don't necessarily have a very strong view in it, but it would be philosophically consistent with the rest of what he's saying. On the question of independence, I genuinely have never understood why Labour are anti-independence. Like why they take such a firm view on the constitutional question. I don't get it. I get it for the Conservatives, the Conservative and Unionist Party. It's sort of in their identity, and it flows from seeing Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as directly inferior partners in this partnership. I do think that's quite clear in right-wing politics, that England is the boss, basically.
Yeah.
But with Labour, that I would like to think isn't there. And so I don't understand why they take such a dogmatic view on the constitutional question. Surely their view should be that we want Scotland to remain part of the Union because they want to remain part of the Union, not because we've gone through some legalistic exercise and done a lot of wrangling to prevent them from having a vote on it.
Yeah.
That's not going to save. If the people of Scotland come to a point where there's a significant majority that wants independence, and good on them, if they want to self-govern, then denying them a referendum is not going to do anything.
I've heard Scots refer to him as King of the North, but south of the border.
To be fair, what's his view on Ukraine? What's his view on Palestine? Who knows? Yeah. He's a regional politician, has been a regional politician for a very long time, that is only now trying to extend his doctrine, trying to see what bits of his philosophy can apply further afield and what can't. And like I said, his first speech at least shows willing, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
An attempt to do that.
Yeah, no, I thought it was very good.
And maybe there will be another speech in which he will speak about, devolution to
foreign policy is coming up next
foreign
week.
Policy, exactly. So, it's very much a work in progress.
But a bloody good start.
But it seems to be what we're getting anyway, so let's at least be positive about it.
Quiet, Riot.
And now it's time for a new segment that tries to zoom out from the trees and reveal a wood that has existed for much longer than we think. It's time for Old News.
The news of yesteryear.
What have you got for us, Naomi?
Housing.
Okay. So, always been a thing.
Always been a thing with me. It has always been a thing.
Always been a thing.
We've always needed shelter. The Halifax Bank at the beginning of this year said that average house prices in the UK had topped 300,000 for the first time. Now, for those of us living in London, boy, oh boy, would we love to be able to buy a property for £300,000. But nationally, that is massive. It means things like first-time buyer deposits are now £61,000 or £125,000 in London. And the headlines that came off the back of it are exactly what you would expect. Young people are locked out. The dream of home ownership is dying. There's now a generation that will rent forever. And it got me thinking that while history rarely repeats, it does often rhyme. And Alex, I could have shown you almost the exact same set of headlines from 2007, from 1989. And
Wow.
stick with me, 1919. So this week, I'm bringing you the housing crisis that has somehow never once in a century not been a crisis. So as I said, right now, 300k average house prices, these enormous deposits being required. Average age someone now buys their first home has crept up to being in your early 30s. And of course, that means that those that haven't managed it are now nicknamed Generation Rent. All sounds very familiar. Not enough homes get built. The ones that do get built are too expensive. Wages don't keep pace. And whatever government is in charge promises to fix it and always falls short of its targets. Let's go back 20 years-ish, run up to the financial crash, all of those subprime mortgages that help fuel it. Same complaint. House prices had detached completely from local wages. First-time buyers were vanishing from the market. And actually the phrase Generation Rent is born and starts doing the rounds in the media. The crash then briefly brought the price of housing down, but did not make them any more affordable because, of course, the mortgages dried up at the same time.
Yeah, and people were offering times your salary much lower.
No need 3 times your salary, all that. Let's go back 40-ish years. So we're in the Thatcher era of the 80s. And this is like the hinge point for the story. This is Thatcher's right to buy, letting council tenants purchase their council homes at a pretty steep discount sometimes. Brilliant if you were one of those tenants that was able to take advantage of that. Less great for the housing market long term. The councils never were able to replace the stock that got sold off. They didn't have the funding to do that.
Well, they didn't see any of this fucking money, did they?
Rent, because the rent paid for them. The council rent they were getting would then pay for the
But they didn't see the money from the sales either. It just got swallowed up in the general pot.
And so 2 million social homes have gone through Right to Buy. Interested to see if Andy Burnham scraps it, actually. And most of them didn't get rebuilt. So the 1980s doesn't cause the crisis exactly, but it is basically the point where the safety net got a hole cut in it that has never been patched up.
Yeah.
So then let's go back to immediately after the First World War. Let's go back to 1918, 1919.
I find that so surprising because so many people died. And
yeah, right.
Spanish flu as well.
But there was a genuine acute housing shortage. Hundreds of thousands of people needed homes for returning soldiers, many of whom came home to slums or no home at all. And Lloyd George passed an act promising 500,000 new homes would be built, and only about 200,000 were. So 107 years ago, the government overpromised on house building, undelivered on its housing target. The public was really angry about the gap between rhetoric and bricks. And if that doesn't describe the inbox of every housing minister since, then I don't know what does.
Wow.
So 1919, you've got an acute shortage and a big promise and a big shortfall. In 80s, you get a policy that drains the stock of housing and doesn't replace it. Late noughties, you're beginning to really detach pricing from wages, a crash that doesn't fix the affordability issue. And now fast forward to present day, house prices up, deposit requirements up, first-time buyers pushed into their 30s, and the stock still not being built, the target's still not being met. So basically the actors change, the slogans change, but the problem just doesn't. And that's old news for this week. Proof that some things never change. They just get a new average price tag.
Yeah, but also a lesson somewhere in there, because in between all of that,
you get Harold Macmillan doing a major
and also you have
program.
you have urban areas flattened by bombing.
Yep.
And then you have this burst of house building. So in with things never change, there is also a hint that things can change
if there is
if there is a will behind it, and they can change quickly. Like that wave lasted 3 years. They built millions of homes.
They did. And it was a Tory that did it.
Thanks, Naomi. Listeners, as ever, will drop a link in the show notes so you can reminisce with us.
And that's the end of today's B-side. A big thanks to Kenny and guest Stephen Boyd, and an even bigger thank you to everybody at home for tuning in.
If you can help support the show for £5 a month or more, head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod so we can keep bringing the show free to everyone at the same time, regardless of their ability to pay.
We'll be back on Sunday to delight you with our musing on everything that's happened since today.
We love you all very, very much.
Bye!
Quiet Riot is an audio production from Cooler Heads, written and produced by Andreou, Naomi Smith, and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu, and edited by me, Alex Reese.
Quiet Riot. 1-0 to Congo.
No. Shut up. Is that true? Ah, for fuck's sake.